welcome to the Labor Force Podcast. Stories of the working class in a time of renewed labor militancy and awareness that capitalism is a rotten deal. I'm your host, Mike Strukin, proud member of New York State United Teachers. Greetings all. Well, you can feel it now, right? Not in the headlines, but in the line at the gas pump. Because in Colony, New York, a suburb of Albany, people weren't lining up for some luxury. They were lining up for slightly cheaper gas. A station dropped prices to $3.83 a gallon. Still expensive, still painful, and the line stretched for a third of a mile. People waiting just to save a few bucks. And one driver said it plainly, the prices are just outrageous. That's where we are. Not chasing opportunity, chasing discounts on survival. And it lines up exactly with the broader data, because according to a new report, half of all consumers say daily living expenses are a financial challenge. Not fringe cases, not just the poor, half. And when you zoom in, it gets worse. 84% of those already struggling say the biggest pressure is groceries and basic household essentials. That's nearly half the country struggling just to afford food. So think about what that really means. It means the economy isn't failing in some abstract way. It's failing in the most basic physical sense. Food, gas, rent, the things you literally need to stay alive and keep moving. And then you lay around the bigger picture, the one that doesn't get talked about enough. Because this isn't just a rough patch. This isn't inflation will cool and things will go back to normal. The argument being made more and more openly now is that the decline of the middle class isn't temporary, it's structural. That what we're experiencing isn't a cycle, it's a shift. A permanent tightening where stability itself becomes something fewer and fewer people can access. And if you step back, the pattern becomes obvious. People are driving across town to save 20 cents on gas. Families are cutting back on groceries. Half the country is saying we're struggling just to get by. At the exact same time, the system keeps telling us everything is fundamentally fine. That disconnect, that's the story. Because if this were just inflation, you'd expect relief by now. If it were just a supply chain issue, you'd expect normalization. But instead, what we're seeing is adaptation, not recovery. People aren't bouncing back, they're adjusting downward. They're redefining what normal means. Normal is waiting in line for cheaper gas. Normal is second-guessing every grocery trip. Normal is having a job and still feeling like you're falling behind. And once that becomes normalized, that's when it locks in. That's when a crisis stops being a crisis and starts being the baseline. And here's the part that should really hit. When half the country is struggling with daily costs, that's not an individual problem. That's not budgeting. That's not personal responsibility. That's systemic. That's an economy where the cost of simply existing is rising faster than people's ability to exist within it. And if nothing fundamentally changes, if wages, power, and priorities stay exactly where they are, then this doesn't resolve, it deepens. Because the real danger isn't just that people are struggling, it's that we're being conditioned to accept that struggle as permanent. Meanwhile, about 3,800 union workers at JBS meatpacking plant in Greeley, Colorado agreed to end a roughly 3-week strike and return to work after the company committed to restarting negotiations, even though no new contract agreement has been reached. The walkout, one of the largest in the U.S. meatpacking industry in decades, was driven by demands for higher wages that keep up with inflation, safer working conditions, and an end to workers being charged for protective equipment. Union leaders emphasized that the dispute is not over, with one stating that workers remain united and will continue to fight for fair treatment, while the company said it is pleased to welcome our team members back as operations resume. The strike had disrupted a major portion of U.S. beef processing capacity and came amid broader industry pressures, including high beef prices and historically low cattle supply, setting the stage for continued tension as negotiations still continue. Out west, a familiar refrain in a familiar sector recently, more than 3,000 healthcare workers across Washington state have gone on strike, including over 2,400 union members in multi-care facilities, alongside hundreds more in Yakima and Puyallup, as they demand improved wages, staffing, and working conditions. Organized through SEIU, workers say they are fighting for wages that keep up with the rising cost of living, as well as safety and safe staffing for our patients, our communities, and our co-workers, and a contract that reflects that we are valued the same as other multi-care area hospitals. Nurses and other staff describe a healthcare system strained by understaffing and resource shortages, with one worker explaining, quote, "We're fighting for a fair contract for everybody. And we want to have good health care and livable wages, while adding, in this economy right now, they're not meeting our needs, and we're just fighting for what is fair. Workers also emphasized concerns about patient care and workplace safety, saying, quote, "We need safe staffing and equitable wages that recruit and retain to ensure that we can deliver the highest quality care," and warning that negotiations have seen barely any movement from management. The strike follows the expiration of contracts and reflects growing frustration among healthcare workers who say they just can't do it anymore under current conditions, highlighting broader tensions in the healthcare system over pay, staffing, and patient care. In contract negotiations between Northern Indiana Public Service Company, NIPSCO, and the United Steelworkers stalled after months of bargaining, culminating in the company locking out roughly 1,600 union workers when the parties failed to reach an agreement by the April 2nd deadline. The dispute centers on key issues, including overtime rules, the use of outside contractors, and proposed changes to benefits and working conditions, with union leaders arguing the company is attempting to erode protections and increase workload pressures. One union representative said the company was, quote, "trying to really strip away a lot of the different types of benefits," emphasizing that workers work a lot of long hours to keep essential services running. NIPSCO, however, maintains it negotiated in good faith, of course, and offers significant wage increases and benefits, but said it could not agree to union demands such as double-time pay in certain situations, stating, quote, "We were unable to reach agreement on provisions related to the union's request for double-time pay, despite the higher-than-historic wage increases." As the lockout continues, both sides remain at an impasse, with operations being maintained by non-union employees and contractors while negotiations remain unresolved. All right, something that shifted in a pretty noticeable way, how economists are talking about AI and jobs. Not the Silicon Valley version, not the breathless version, but the people who usually spend a lot of time saying, "hold on, let's see the evidence first." For a while, that was the story. Warnings that AI was about to tear through the labor market. A lot of economists treated that as hype, or at least as premature. If young college grads were having trouble finding work, they pointed to interest rates, broader uncertainty, the usual macro stuff. If a company blamed layoffs on AI, plenty of people figured that was just executives doing a little image management, kind of AI washing bad decisions. And to be fair, they had reasons to be skeptical. We've heard big claims before about technology changing everything overnight, and usually it takes longer, gets messier, and lands differently than the boosters promise. But now the tone is changing. Not to AI has already wrecked the job market. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is more unsettling, honestly. It hasn't fully hit yet, but it very well could, and we're not ready. That shift seems to have accelerated as the tools started to look more capable and more dependable to the people studying them. One economist, Alex Simas at the University of Chicago, said he was skeptical at first when ChatGPT came out. Powerful, sure, but error-prone, inconsistent, and not really good enough for a lot of professional work. What changed for him was the arrival of models that could reason through a problem step by step. That made the system seem useful on a different level. For others, it was coding tools, or these AI agents that can carry out tasks more directly. Molly Kinder at Brookings described trying some of these tools and realizing they could do the kind of basic research you usually hand to college students or recent grads. That's the part that should make workers sit up a little straighter, because when experts stop talking in the abstract and start saying, hang on, I can see where this hits the hiring ladder, that's different. And researchers are increasingly framing this as real labor market shock, even if it's still more visible in expectation than in the top-line data. There's still uncertainty. AI could spread fast or slow. It could hit narrow parts of the economy or a lot of them. But the center of gravity has moved. Economists are no longer mostly arguing about whether this is serious. They're increasingly arguing about how serious, how soon, and who gets hit first. So what's actually happening now? Well, one important point here is that AI is not just a lab demo anymore. Companies are using it more than they were, and workers are using it even more, at least by self-reporting. According to Census Bureau data, nearly 1 in 5 companies said they used AI in the previous 2 weeks, and in some industries it was twice that. Workers reported higher use than employers, which suggests a lot of people are experimenting on their own, maybe with or without formal approval. That matters, because labor market change doesn't only happen when the boss sends out a memo. Sometimes it starts with workers trying to keep up, trying to save time, trying not to fall behind. But here's the distinction that keeps coming up, and it's an important one. Reshaping jobs is not the same thing as replacing jobs. Those get lumped together way too often. A lot of work is made up of tasks, and a lot of those tasks can be automated or assisted while others still depend on human judgment, relationships, or just accountability. A Boston Consulting Group estimate says more than half of U.S. jobs could be reshaped by AI in the next 2 or 3 years, while far fewer would be replaced outright. That sounds less dramatic than mass unemployment, but from a worker's point of view, reshaping can still be a huge deal. If your job gets carved up, sped up, monitored more closely, or downgraded into a kind of editor of the machine role, that is still a labor issue. Maybe you keep the job, maybe the pay, the training path, or the dignity of the work changes. That counts. And the workers who look especially exposed right now are entry-level white-collar workers. That comes up again and again. There is some evidence from Stanford researchers that employment was already declining for entry-level workers in jobs highly exposed to AI, and you can see why people are worried. A lot of junior work involves research, drafting, basic analysis, early-stage coding, all the stuff organizations used to hand to younger workers so they could learn the ropes. If companies decide the machine could do enough of that cheaply, then the problem isn't just immediate job loss, it's the broken ladder. How do new graduates get in? How do they build experience if the beginner tasks are the first to go or get squeezed? That's a labor market problem with a long tail. It affects bargaining power, career development, and who gets a foothold at all. And that gets to the real question. Not is AI magical, not will work disappear tomorrow. The question is, how fast does this spread and how widely? Because speed and breadth are what determine whether a technological change is manageable or brutal. If the rollout is gradual, workers have some room to breathe. Older workers might finish out their careers. Younger workers might redirect, retrain, or move into jobs the technology doesn't hit as hard. If the effects stay concentrated in certain sectors, then at least there are other places to go. That's still disruption, but it's disruption people can maybe navigate. If it's broad and fast, that's where things can get ugly. Workers don't get time to adapt. The usual adjustment process breaks down. And inequality can widen fast because the gains don't necessarily go to the people whose jobs are being changed. They may go to firms, to investors, to a smaller group of more senior workers, while everybody else gets told to be flexible. That's why a lot of economists are saying policymakers need to stop acting like this is a future memo and start treating it like a current planning problem. Update unemployment insurance. expand who it actually covers, because many new graduates likely to be hit first aren't well covered by the current system. Fix retraining programs that are too slow and too underfunded. Start thinking seriously about support for workers displaced or otherwise harmed, not after the shock, but before it really arrives. And even there's a warning. Some economists think the usual tools may not be enough if this turns out to be less like a temporary downturn and more like a lasting structural shift. That's the policy gap here. We've got a lot of talk about what the technology can do, and not nearly enough about what workers are supposed to do if the transition is fast, uneven, and permanent for some people. So yeah, a more skeptical way to put all this is, the panic still isn't proof, but the old dismissal is fading. Economists are taking the risk more seriously, especially for workers at the bottom rungs of white-collar hiring. And if the people who usually say, let's not overreact, are now saying, maybe we should prepare, that's worth listening to. That all said, according to the Economic Times, leaked internal documents suggest Amazon is pursuing an aggressive automation strategy that could dramatically reshape its workforce, with plans to replace or avoid up to 600,000 U.S. jobs by 2027. The documents indicate the company plans to automate as much as 75% of its warehouse and logistics operations, potentially eliminating around 160,000 roles in the near term, while saving an estimated $12.6 billion in labor costs. Robots, such as advanced systems capable of moving, sorting, and packing goods, are expected to take over repetitive tasks, increasing efficiency and speed while reducing reliance on human labor. The shift may also extend into delivery and logistics through AI and autonomous technologies, raising concerns about widespread job displacement across multiple sectors. While Amazon denies that the documents represent a formal layoff plan and insists automation will create new technical roles, workers and experts worry the transition could reduce opportunities, widen inequality between low and high-skilled jobs, and set a precedent for other companies to follow, potentially accelerating automation-driven job losses across the broader economy.
Everyone faces the same issues, and everyone will see as the cost of living goes up even more and more, as these wars overseas don't benefit us. They will shortly see that the path forward is towards a more equitable economy and towards policies that focus on, the U.S. and U.S. citizens. So.
Thank you. I love what you just said about everybody faces the same issue, because a lot of Trump supporters also live with that, also live in poverty, are lower to middle income class folks. And yet somehow they don't share the same view that you share about fighting for the middle class. Instead, they support the billionaire class. Yeah. If you could speak to them, hopefully get them to change their mind, bring them further to the right side, what would you possibly say?
Yeah, it starts about just caring about other people, caring about our neighbors. And, when things hit the fan, the billionaires will not fight for us. They will not fight for our interests. And only we can fight for ourselves and help each other together. So, yeah, with time.
Beautifully put, thank you. And you just mentioned last thing that you are not personally, thankfully, dealing with student loan debt, but you do know friends who are. Do you happen to know what level of debt your friends are dealing with?
I've had friends who've had to drop out of college because they have had too much debt, and that equation just doesn't work out for them for staying in college.
It's unfortunate. Is there anybody, you guys out here also live with student loan debt?
Yeah.
Would you mind sharing how much you are owing?
I think 20,000. I mean, as a student worker at MSU, we're not paid enough. We're paid like minimum wage still, which is not enough to get by, especially in a city like East Lansing that's very, very expensive. Rent can be very often like $800 to $1,200. $1,500 a month just for like a single room, not even for an apartment, and we're still paid minimum wage, even though like this university is ran by student labor, and like it runs the dining halls, we clean all the apartments, and we're not respected.
It's really upsetting. Is that your experience as well?
I'm lucky to not have to deal with a ton of student loan debt at this point, but I know that I will be. That's a vast majority of people who go here is nobody can really pay for college in full. So at some point I'm going to have to take on a lot of debt, and it's just really not fair. I come from a middle class background, and I'm going to have to take out significant loans in order to pay for school, and people who have it worse than I do are going to have to do way more than I will, and that's just absolutely horrible.
Is that also your experience here?
Yeah, I mean, the only way I was able to go here was by going to community college for, 1 year during high school and then 1 year after high school. So I think that's a lot of people's experiences is like, it's really a burden to go here for 4 years.
Is there a future where you foresee paying off this debt to any level quite yet?
Maybe.
Yeah.
If we're
Yeah.
lucky.
Yeah, if we're lucky, we'll get to pay off debt, but I don't know yet.
Yeah, what would you like to say to the Trump supporters who do not support canceling student loan debt, who do not support affordable healthcare and affordable educations?
You try paying for it. It's not easy. A lot of people have like an outside perspective looking in where they see, education as sort of a privilege, but like, I can't pay for this stuff on my own. You guys should, try it.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's an investment in our future, right? Because we're going to grow up, we're going to enter the workforce, and we're going to, participate in every area of society. And by investing in like our education, we're investing in our future, and that's something that I think is important, and I'm willing to pay, in 10 years, even just right now, more taxes to support that.
That clip courtesy of Status Quo News, with Michigan State students talking about their situations after a rally Wednesday night for Senate candidate Abdul Al-Sayed. Well, one fact is clear. These younger generations are not just waiting for all this to collapse their fates. They're doing the one thing they really can do to gain some sense of agency: organizing. For a long time in the U.S., a college degree was treated like a sure thing. Not a guarantee of instant success, maybe, but a smart and reliable bet. Get the diploma, and you'd likely earn more, have more stability, and land somewhere in the broad category of professional. Politicians said it, parents repeated it, guidance counselors built entire lives around it. And for decades, the numbers mostly backed up the story. But starting in the mid-2000s, something shifted in a way that hasn't fully sunk in. The long-term payoff of a college degree began to weaken. Not for everyone, not in every field, but enough that it changed the trajectory of a generation. And one of the most surprising outcomes of that shift is what we're going to talk about now: the rise of a college-educated slice of the workforce that's showing up in retail and service jobs, feeling downwardly mobile and increasingly turning toward unions. To understand how big this change is, it helps to remember what college used to represent. In 1950, only a small share of Americans had degrees. College was comparatively affordable, and the credential itself unlocked a lot. Even as recently as 2010, degree holders were still seeing a huge wage premium compared with people without degrees. And if you didn't go to college, there were still plenty of paths that weren't glamorous but were solid: skilled trades, stable blue-collar work, unionized jobs in industries like hospitality. You could build a life without the 4-year detour and the debt. Fast forward to now. More than half of working-age adults have college degrees. And yes, on average, degree holders still earn more than non-degree holders, but the direction of travel is what matters. After about 2005, wages for many graduates stopped rising the way they used to. The market for jobs that really require a degree tightened, and college got dramatically more expensive, which meant the debt started functioning like a long-term tax on your future. One statistic captures the problem. A recent report found that 5 years after finishing school, only about a little over half of graduates were actually working in jobs that require a college degree. That means a huge number of people did what they were told, paid what they were asked to pay, and then landed in work that doesn't match the promise. Often that work is in the service economy: retail, food, customer support, jobs that can be exhausting, insecure, and underpaid. And when you're in that position, the idea of organizing starts to look less like an old-fashioned relic and more like one of the few levers you can still pull. This is the landscape explored in Noam Schieber's book, Mutiny: The Rise and Revolt of the College-Educated Working Class. Schieber has spent years reporting on workplaces like Starbucks, Apple Retail, video game studios, and even Hollywood writers' rooms. The big picture is simple. Campaigns to unionize have surged across sectors where you wouldn't necessarily expect to see so many people with college degrees. These aren't exclusively college grad movements, but a lot of the energy, and many of the stories, come from workers who were trained, credentialed, and told to aim higher than the jobs they ended up with. If you've been paying attention since the early 2010s, this may sound familiar. The disappointment of indebted graduates helped fuel political movements like Occupy Wall Street, and later it became part of the base for left populist figures pushing student debt relief and economic reform. What's different here is the workplace angle. For a long time, college-educated Americans were not the face of labor organizing. Unions were something other people joined. Now, more degree holders are discovering that the problems they're facing are at their core labor problems. One story in Schieber's reporting makes this shift feel especially concrete. The experience of Chaya Barrett, an Apple Store worker in the Baltimore area. Her background is pretty representative of a lot of millennials. She grew up around the expectation that college was the path upward. She attended Towson University, and while she was in school, she began working at an Apple Store, at first as something that felt like a stepping stone, not a destination. But Apple retail wasn't like every other mall job. Apple sold more than devices. It sold a sense of mission. The company's retail culture emphasized education, creativity, and what sounded like kind of a modern humanism. Early Apple stores made a big show of being about learning as much as sales. There were roles like creative, where workers taught customers how to make music or edit videos. There were geniuses, a title that made tech support sound almost mythic. Internally, there were slogans about enriching lives and helping dreamers become doers. You can hear how seductive that is, especially if you're young, educated, carrying debt, and looking for a job that doesn't feel like surrender. Barrett, in this telling, didn't just feel employed, she felt chosen. Over time, she moved into the creative role and stayed insulated from hard sales pressure. And even while she was living at home and staring down around $50,000 in student debt, the work felt meaningful enough that she wasn't only measuring it by the hourly wage. Then the floor started to drop. After Steve Jobs died and Tim Cook took over, the company put more emphasis on efficiency and cost cutting. That played out in the retail stores in ways workers could see and feel. More temporary staffing, leaner schedules, fewer people doing more tasks. At Barrett's store, the headcount reportedly shrank dramatically over a few years. Training changed too. What had once been a carefully staged, in-person ramp-up became something more like clicking through modules on a screen. And that kind of downgrade matters, because it signals what the company thinks the job is worth. When a role is treated like it's interchangeable, workers start to feel interchangeable. A perfect example came with the rollout of Apple's Vision Pro. Workers were given complex scripts and procedures without enough time to learn them properly. A small group got flown out for training, and then the rest of the workforce was expected to absorb it quickly, on the fly. The script didn't hold, sales were disappointing, and for workers who had bought into the idea that Apple retail was elevated, moments like this made it harder to keep believing. That combination, shrinking staffing, reduced training, rising demands, and a sense that the lofty talk was just branding, creates the right conditions for organizing. In 2022, Barrett and her co-workers won a union election at the Towson store. Other stores in places like Kansas City, St. Louis, and Tulsa also pushed toward union votes. And it's impossible to separate this from the pandemic years. The pandemic rearranged how people thought about work. For many retail and service workers, it was the clearest possible lesson in who takes the risk and who makes the decisions. When companies rolled back safety protocols and rushed toward business as usual, plenty of workers interpreted it as a message. Your safety is negotiable, and your comfort is secondary. In Apple stores specifically, even visible protections, like physical barriers that separated staff from customers, were removed quickly. For workers who had once tolerated low pay because the job felt special, that kind of disregard lands differently. Even when workers do win union recognition, there's another harsh reality. Bargaining can take forever. Companies stall, lawyers slow walk, negotiations drag on. And the point isn't just that organizing is hard, it's that the fight doesn't end when the vote is counted. The vote is the start of a longer confrontation over control, time, wages, and dignity. So why are unions suddenly appealing to people with degrees, people who historically were often told they were above that kind of thing? One reason is emotional and even philosophical. A lot of degree holders were promised meaningful work, not only a paycheck, but identity, purpose, the feeling that their labor expressed who they were and made the world better. When they discover that the mission language is mostly a corporate costume, they go looking for meaning somewhere else. For some, organizing becomes that meaning. It offers community, a shared project, and a way to turn frustration into collective action. Another reason is more structural. The myth of college as an automatic escalator has cracked. Once you look closely, the payoff varies enormously depending on race, class, the kind of school you attended, and what you studied. Research has suggested that for Black Americans born in the 1980s, the lifetime wealth boost from a degree can be close to non-existent on average. Graduates from non-selective schools often face worse outcomes than graduates of selective ones, and majors matter a lot. STEM degrees tend to have a far higher chance of paying off than humanities degrees, especially when student debt is involved. This is why it's misleading when people casually talk about college graduates as one privileged blob. Often what they really mean is a smaller group, graduates of elite schools, or people whose degrees plug neatly into high-paying fields like engineering, finance, or certain business tracks. But that's not the whole category. There are plenty of graduates working retail, juggling bills, living with family longer than they expected, and realizing the social story they were sold doesn't match the economic reality they're living. Shieber's reporting also invites a bigger historical question. If unions make sense for workers, why did so many college-educated workers resist them for so long? One way to think about that goes back to a framework developed by Barbara and John Ehrenreich in the late 1970s, the idea of a professional managerial class, sometimes shortened to PMC. In their view, the modern economy created a layer of people who weren't owners, but weren't traditional laborers either. Professionals and managers who use credentials, licensing, and expert status to carve out higher pay and authority. Doctors, lawyers, professors, administrators, scientists, middle managers. Their power wasn't based on owning the company. It was based on being the certified experts the system said it needed. Licensing and credentials limited entry into the best roles, which helped keep wages elevated and protected the idea that these jobs were somehow above ordinary workplace conflict. For a while, that arrangement worked well enough that lots of college-educated workers saw themselves as separate from the rest of the working class. They were paid more. They had prestige. They were offered a kind of identity as the experts. And that identity did real political work. It made unions seem unnecessary, even slightly beneath them. By the 1980s, union approval among highly educated people was notably low, and politics also shifted. The Democratic Party moved away from its New Deal-era working-class base and toward a coalition more centered on educated professionals. But the forces that hammered the traditional working class didn't stop there. Outsourcing, automation, consolidation, and relentless cost-cutting eventually reached the professions, too. Stable academic jobs gave way to armies of adjuncts. Independent medical and legal practices were absorbed by corporate chains. White-collar work that once felt protected began to look, more and more, like just another cost center to be minimized. Then came the price of the ticket, the cost of college itself. Tuition and fees ballooned over the decades, rising far faster than overall consumer prices. So now, for many people, joining the professional class required taking on heavy debt. And at the same time, the demand for degree-requiring jobs began to soften. Research from the Federal Reserve System has pointed to a decline in demand for college-educated labor since around 2010. Job postings requiring degrees have become less common relative to postings that don't. In plain terms, more people are getting degrees, and the economy is offering fewer degree jobs in return. The Ehrenreichs revisited their own analysis years later and essentially admitted that the dream had collapsed. The idea that credentialed experts would be indispensable, insulated, and able to steer society through expertise ran into a simpler truth. Corporate dominance doesn't stop at the factory floor. It expands upward. If your labor can be made cheaper, sped up, outsourced, or automated, it will be. That's the background for why it matters when you see a barista with a resume that includes prestigious fellowships, or an Apple retail worker with a college degree and big ambitions showing up at a union meeting. It's not that college graduates are saving the labor movement. It's that the circle of people who can recognize themselves as workers, people with shared leverage and shared vulnerability, may be widening. One of the bleakest, funniest details in this whole story is also maybe the most revealing. Shieber writes about salts, organizers who take jobs specifically to help unionize a workplace. And one college-educated salt at Starbucks reportedly realized that, wage-wise, it was the best job he'd ever had. If a coffee chain is your personal wage high-water mark after investing in a degree, that's not a quirky anecdote, that's a warning light. And the road ahead may get rougher. Companies now have a new tool that can be used as both an actual replacement for labor and as a threat hanging over workers: AI. 20 years ago, law firms sent document review overseas. Now firms can automate parts of legal research. Tech once looked like the safe harbor, the place where skills would future-proof your career. But we're already seeing automation and AI reshape coding and engineering work too, shrinking teams and piling tasks onto fewer people. So the lesson from this new wave of organizing isn't just about Starbucks or Apple. It's about what happens when a society builds an entire moral and economic narrative around college as the path to stability, then quietly changes the terms of the deal. When that happens, people look for other ways to regain control over their lives. Sometimes that search takes the shape of politics. Sometimes it takes the shape of community mutual aid. And sometimes, increasingly, it takes the shape of a union drive at a workplace that was never supposed to be anyone's final stop. The big question is what comes next. If more educated workers see themselves as workers, do we get stronger labor coalitions? Do we get new forms of solidarity across job types and backgrounds? Or do companies succeed in fragmenting people? Degree versus no degree, full-time versus temp, career track versus just passing through. What's clear is that the old promise is no longer enough. Get a degree and you'll be fine. For millions of people, that promise is already broken. And in the space where that promise used to be, the labor movement is offering something different. Not a guarantee, not a fairy tale, but a practical idea. If the system treats you like it costs to be cut, you might need to organize like a worker to be heard. Let's bring this all back around to a big claim from historian Sven Beckert. Capitalism had a beginning, and that means it can have an end. That sounds simple, but it pushes against a really common idea, especially in our own time, that markets are just human nature. That capitalism is basically how people have always lived once they got past barter and kings and all that. Beckert says no. Capitalism is historical. It was made, it spread, it won. And because it's a system made by people in history, it is not eternal. That matters right now because people look around at financial crises, wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and of course now Iran, rising powers in the global south, and this general feeling that the post-war order is cracking. So is capitalism collapsing? Beckert's answer is kind of interesting. Politically, geopolitically, yeah, this era looks strained. But economically, capitalism is still remarkably strong because for the first time, one mode of production dominates almost the whole planet. Even states that still call themselves communists don't really offer a worked-out alternative to market-based economics. So the system looks shaky and dominant at the same time. That tension is part of the story. Beckert's book is huge, more than 1,200 pages, and it tries to tell the story across roughly 1,000 years. Not because he thinks capitalism popped into existence in, say, the 11th century. Actually, he's pretty explicit that you can't neatly circle one date on the calendar and say, there, capitalism begins. Early on, lots of other economic logics were still in play. His point is that capitalism emerged as a process. A new logic spread through networks, often through people who owned capital and organized long-distance trade or banking. You had, in a sense, capitalists before you had full-blown capitalism. And this is where Beckert is pushing past older debates. He draws on a lot of traditions. Adam Smith, Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, a whole lot of specialized scholarship. But one major influence is Ferdinand Braudel. From Braudel, he takes merchant capital, trade across regions, including non-European regions, and the role of states. Capitalism didn't arise just because somebody invented efficiency. It grew through trade networks, political backing, and state power. For Beckert, the key turning point comes in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, with European expansion. And I should say he's careful here. He doesn't want a simple Europe invents everything story. In fact, he argues capitalism has to be understood globally, even in its most Eurocentric moments. His phrase, basically, is that capitalism was born global. So yes, Europe becomes central, but only through worldwide connections, extraction, and exchange. Europe doesn't make capitalism in isolation. It rises through global interdependence. Cotton is a really concrete example. Beckert wrote Empire of Cotton before this, and some critics said, okay, but are you just telling the history of one commodity? In the new book, he broadens the frame. Cotton matters not because it's the whole story, but because it shows the whole story. You can't explain industrialization in England without looking at transformed agriculture in the American South. You can't tell the story of factories without plantations, shipping, finance, and state power. That's capitalism as a world process, not a national one. And from the start, this system was never just about peaceful contracts. Beckert says capitalist expansion relied on what he calls extra economic coercion. That's the fancy term, but the idea is straightforward. Force outside the wage contract. Conquest, enslavement, colonial rule, legal compulsion, military violence. So when people describe capitalism as if it naturally emerged from free exchange between equal individuals, Beckert says that's ideology, not history. Trade, cotton, banking, empire, state power, coercion, all of it is there from the beginning. That's the setup for the next part of the story, because once you see capitalism as historical and global, you also have to see the struggle shaped it at every step. So let's stay with that word, coercion. Beckert really wants to break the comforting story that capitalism starts out violent, maybe, but then matures into a peaceful world of contracts and freedom. He says no, not really. In its major phases, capitalism has been tied to violent conquest. Europe was central to that from the late 18th century into the mid-20th, but again, always through global relationships. Slavery, empire, war, colonial extraction, these were not side effects. They were part of how capitalist growth happened. That helps explain the 19th century, which Becker describes as the emergence of a capitalist civilization. Not just an economy, a civilization. A self-aware bourgeois takes shape, people who understand themselves as a class with shared interests, culture, institutions, and power. Now, he's not saying classes are ever perfectly unified. They aren't. Same with workers. Working class formation was uneven, conflict-ridden, split by race, gender, nationality, skill, all that. But class identities harden in this period, and the social world gets reorganized around capital accumulation. Even the family matters here. Beckett argues capitalism likely requires the bourgeois family because the family helps pass down property, reproduce social networks, shape bourgeois culture, and literally reproduce the workforce. He agrees strongly with Nancy Fraser's point that capitalism depends on the non-market to make markets possible. In other words, capitalism is never just the market. It leans on unpaid and often hidden forms of social reproduction. But this same century also produces resistance. Beckett points to the mid-19th century as an age of rebellions, and that phrase is doing a lot of work. Dynamic capitalist economies were crashing into older political arrangements, older labor systems, including slavery and older forms of rule. The result was upheaval. Workers organized, enslaved people rebelled, existing labor systems were challenged, and in time marginalized. Becker specifically points to slave rebellions in the Caribbean as crucial to ending plantation slavery and to labor struggles in the late 19th and 20th centuries as forces that changed capitalism from below. That's important because it brings us back to the present. For a while, especially in the neoliberal era, a lot of elites acted like markets and contracts were basically a law of nature. Politics was supposed to step aside. History was over. Well, that story has cracked. Today we can see coercion more clearly again. Becker says some features of our moment echo the late 19th century, though not in a simple replay. The big difference is that Europe is no longer the center of the global economy. The most dynamic capitalist economies now are in Asia, so the old patterns are returning in a new global configuration. And that leads to the political takeaway. Becker engages the idea of real utopias, little islands of non-capitalist social relations. He compares that to how islands of capital once expanded. He doesn't give a blueprint, and honestly, probably nobody can. But he does make two clear claims. First, capitalism is historical, not natural. Second, everything with a beginning has an end. If this system was built through struggle, through conquest, through law, through resistance and counter-resistance, then it can also be changed through struggle. That's the labor angle I keep coming back to. Workers did not just live under capitalism. Workers, enslaved people, and anti-colonial movements helped force its transformations. So when people say, well, this is just how the world works, Becker's history says no, and what was made can be remade.
Capitalism, I guess the reason why the word is so uncomfortable, it's also because it talks about this capital, that in itself the word presumes non-democratic social relations, while if you talk about the market economy, you instead focus on this world of freedom that supposedly is all about our choice.
Americans and others had to be persuaded not to believe their own eyes. For example, if you have a bunch of $100 bills sitting there, that can be called capital. People do that. But it's just money. Is it doing anything? No, it's sitting there. It isn't doing anything. It's just green pieces of paper. So when you say money begets more money, you're saying something that makes no sense. I've been watching this money on the table for 2 days. It hasn't begot anything. It just sits there.
So the rising cost of simply existing, the normalization of struggle, the strikes and lockouts, the quiet but accelerating pressure of AI, and this growing wave of workers, even college-educated workers, turning toward organizing, you start to see the through line. This isn't a series of isolated stories. It's one system under strain. A system where people are being asked to accept less stability, less security, less return on the promises they were told to believe in, while being told at the same time that nothing is fundamentally wrong, that this is just how things are now. But history tells a different story, because the conditions we're living through, they're not inevitable, they're not natural, they're the result of choices, economic, political, and social choices, that have shifted power in very specific directions over time. And what we're seeing right now is what happens when those choices start to hit a breaking point. Workers walking out, organizing, questioning the deal itself. Not just asking for higher wages, but asking why the baseline feels so much lower to begin with. And that's where this moment becomes something more than just hardship. It becomes a turning point, because the real question isn't whether people are struggling. We already know they are. The question is what people do with that realization. Do we keep adjusting downward, redefining normal until instability feels permanent? Or do more people start connecting the dots, seeing their individual struggles as part of something collective, something systemic, something that can actually be challenged? Because if capitalism is something that was built through power, policy, and conflict, then it's also something that can be reshaped the same way. And that doesn't happen all at once. It happens the way it always has, through pressure, organization, and people deciding that the way things are isn't the way they have to stay. Well, that does it for this episode. If you like what you hear, give a rate or review on your favorite podcast app to help me grow. I'm proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, with over 200 labor shows you can check out at laborradionetwork.org. This has been the Labor Force Podcast. I'm Mike Strukin. Solidarity, always.